my name is Ella, and in this video I'm going to be discussing a short story by Chinelo Onwualu that was published in 2019 called What the Dead Man Said. My primary focus is going to be on the concept of birth, or rather its roles and implications within the story, but I'm going to be expanding on another group of broader categories like Afrofuturism, sexual violence, and traditional Nigerian practices. This will kind of show how the theme of birth operates within a wider social and cultural context. The first little bit of context that we need to understand this analysis is the background behind the author. Onwualu is Nigerian, she's queer, and she's feminist, which this work is something that really reflects that. She engages a lot with social justice issues and supports a lot of charities and organizations. The organizations in particular that really stood out to me were the Association for Women's Rights in Development and Action Aid Nigeria. These two organizations in particular show her support for advocacy in Nigeria and just general women's issues. This background is basically the framework for why she writes the way she does. I'm going to try and summarize what the dead man said in the best way I can, but it's such a layered piece to where even with the amount that I'm about to say, it still would do you better to read it yourself. The first line of the story is, I suppose you could say it started with a storm. Weather is also a really big symbol in this story, and I kind of get into that, but that's not really where my priorities lie. I'm just not going to elaborate a lot, and you have to understand that I have so much to say. The setting that she resides in is called Toronto, which I think is supposed to be Toronto, Canada, which is part of North America, which she then follows that with colonialists still call it North America. This implication then automatically says that there was colonization, but there was a point in which America had been reclaimed by the natives of that land. We don't really know when it's set in. I know that it's said multiple times that it's in the 22nd century, which means it's like 2170 or something. Our main character is named Azuka. She left her hometown at 12 years old, and then it was like, oh, it's 33-ish years later, 45. And the reason she left her home, I will get to. She's on a train, and she sees a sign that's holographic, and it's an ad for a fertility treatment. She also claims that this is distorted by the rain, usage of weather as a symbol. It also says, keep New Biafra alive. She turns away from it, and she is revealed to have had ocular implants that, enhancing it, I guess. All you really have to know is fertility treatment. She looks away from it. She says that she's passing from Nigeria to New Biafra. Her implant, after she goes over the, transition line between these two, her language in her earpiece or implant changes to Igbo. And it says that English is not a recognized language here. So Biafra was something that did exist. It still does exist as a movement, but it is not recognized as its own state or anything. It was a secessionist state, and it declared its independence from colonial Nigeria in the 1960s. It got chopped in the 1970s and kind of just turned into another part of Nigeria. The reason that Biafra was formed in a real context was because of a massacre, first of all, and also just the general marginalization of Igbo culture. But basically, again, what you have to get from that is Biafra was a state that existed for Igbo people, and it was created because Igbo people were being suppressed, and it went away. But in here, it's New Biafra, and it's here, and it exists in the 22nd century. This is the first time we see an italicized phrase that is allegedly said to Azuka from the dead man. His first message was, you can't put it off forever. The reason she's coming back on this train to her hometown is because she got a notification that her father has died. Her hometown is called Onitsha? This is still existing, and it is a central indigenous spot for the Igbo tribe. Then we know about this thing called the catastrophe. It was a disastrous environmental event that happened in the 2020s to 2060s that scorched half the world and drowned the rest. And that having children is now rare and expensive. Generally, the richer people at the top of the pyramid and hierarchy were the ones to have more children. And as the author actually states, in real life, in Nigeria, we live in a society that is one of the most unequal in the world. The rich are incredibly rich, and the poor are incredibly poor. The Igbo people created the state of New Biafra to separate from the crumbling colonist creation of Nigeria. They took over the suburbs and created bioengineered forests and monorail systems for transport, which means that they're very environmentally forward. But in this, they neglected growing the population in favor of developing this state, and anyone who could have 3+ children at this point is heavily rewarded by the government. She now gets off the train and she visits her old house. Who she sees there is another character who is a close friend of her grandmother's. Her name is Auntie Chio. They call close family friends aunties uncles. Auntie Chio is almost 90 years old. Now, as Izuka's looking around her old house, she notices that the guardhouse is gone, for reasons I will explain later. Goes into the house, and her father, who's dead, is in a biodegradable pod next to her. And people are just like, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. And she's like, Auntie Chio, in her probably best intentions, says, it's a shame your father never got to see any kids from you. And then she says, I'm glad we're gonna see them on his behalf. A lot to unpack in this sentence with all the context given. But basically, Izuka's reminded that, in her words, she's a failure to her family, as she failed to produce the next generation. And though Chio probably did not intend this to be such a heavy-weighted sentence, she's putting Izuka down pretty badly for not having kids and kind of putting this pressure on her that you will have kids soon. And she says this thing which didn't make sense to me when I read it the first time, but did after I kind of researched Nigeria's treatment of women. But Auntie Chio says that if not for their ability to bear children, that the people in their culture would not have valued them, and they hadn't valued them in the past, and that they now know the value of their bodies. This kind of rises in intensity again because she continues to hammer on the pressure. You have to have kids. Izuka reveals at this point that she absolutely recoils at the idea of conception. And that even if she were to somehow get magically pregnant or have a surrogate or something like that, just have a kid in some capacity, she's worried that what happened to her would happen to them. What happened to her? She unveils what happened after someone comes up to her in a funeral and says that Izuka's father is the reason she's here today. She said that he supported her after her rape and financially supported her very heavily. Izuka then says that her father reacted quite differently when it happened to her. To put this in the most blunt way possible, she was repeatedly raped and assaulted by her uncle in the family guardhouse, which is why she said she noticed the guardhouse was gone. This repeated event in her childhood affected her in all aspects of her life. 33 years later, as a middle-aged woman, she is still haunted and traumatized by this fact. She's violated constantly in her dreams, and the dead man is her father. He haunts her in the shadows. He is who is talking to her when it's in italics. And this is the first time that she speaks back to him. It's not really clear how they're having this conversation, but I'm kind of assuming that he's just a ghost. This could be due to her unfinished business with her father, that kind of unfinished stuff has materialized him in her head. And that's how she's speaking to him, is because in her head it was just so open-ended. Kind of had to continue to speak to him. After her uncle was arrested and word got out of her assault, her family was completely ostracized. Silently, but very much so. In Nigeria, it's common for women to be blamed for their rape, and her family were shamed for her allowance to be tainted, even though it wasn't her fault at all. She was a kid. Now, in this conversation, she's obviously angrily speaking to him. He tries to be like, oh, well, I'm sorry. You need to forgive all the people around you. You need to realize that the memories of you are all that matters. And in this, birth is also brought up again. Her having children is also brought up again. He says, in the end, all that matters is the memories of people who knew you, especially your children. Crazy work. Even in his ghost form, he still finds a way to guilt her. Now, her dad is not a bad person, I'm thinking. He's described as a kind-hearted man. All of these things that he did, lots of people are crying over him. He had a whole big family. He did very nice things for people, and people are mourning him. But this attitude that he had towards his daughter after her rape was cold and was distant, and she hates him for that. The ghost of her father explains this and says that it was the guilt of his failure as a father to protect her. He fully apologizes multiple times. He says, I'm so sorry, you're still mad at me. She does not accept it once. She does not even think about accepting it. She's like, that does not make it okay. At this point, he dissipates. He goes away and he disappears, and she does not see him anymore. After that, she starts crying, and a storm begins. Weather as a symbol. Auntie Chiyo comes up behind her and gives her a hug. Zuka's angry and just wants to push her away, but when she sees how genuine and understanding and loving that Auntie Chiyo's face is, she kind of lets her hug her and love her. Azuka never got full closure. This is kind of the end of it. It does kind of say, like, this is the beginning of her journey of acceptance. This is the beginning of her kind of learning to accept this and adapt to it. But it never says that she kind of got any kind of closure from this experience. Now, I want to kind of connect this to Wyndham's rule, and particularly the statement, the apocalypse is never singular. An earthquake, an epidemic might be a catastrophe, but the apocalypse bundles together multiple forces and changes everything irreparably. If Wyndham's rule holds, there's no saving to be had in such simple fashion. The apocalypses that Wyndham imagines are more unsettling. They fundamentally change how society is constituted after they occur. There's no going back to how things were. Azuka was majorly affected by this giant event, but it wasn't just this event. She was ruined equally by her father's reaction to it, the isolation of all of her peers, this literal massive climate disaster that has had lasting effects on the world for as long as she can remember. She also has this giant guilt of not being able to continue her family's legacy because she literally cannot fathom having kids. She's constantly haunted by her past and has a literal ghost of her father following her around until assuming that he goes away at the end of the story. She wasn't ever going to get closure in the end. She did learn things. She got a slight understanding. And she got to experience the love of this family friend. She's finally learning to grow from these atrocities 33 years later. And yes, it does take that many years to see a difference. I don't think she's ever going to have kids, and I think she'll be okay with that in the end. But she will continue to be affected by that constant pressure by everybody around her. As for this giant world event, they did come back from it by this beautiful rebuilt of architecture and wildlife and forest life in a really picture-perfect state. But they made this giant mistake by neglecting making a population. And despite how long it has been since this catastrophe, they still have no people. They might be wiped out because there's no people. The event is still actively destroying the world, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to come back from. It's been centuries, and they still are feeling the effects. Okay, going back to, she was 12 when she left. She was entirely removed from the situation. Her abuser went to jail. She came out of it relatively uninjured. But these solutions don't guarantee recovery, and she essentially goes her entire life devastated over this childhood memory. Afrofuturism. Going back to her world, the New Biafra and Toronto. This is a very Afrofuturist approach. Afrofuturism, as loosely defined by a podcast by Imaginary Worlds on Afrofuturism called African Sci-Fi Looks to a Future Climate. What would African philosophies, traditions, cultures, languages, and communities look like if they were allowed to have evolved and hadn't been stunted or erased by colonialism? For Onwualo's approach to Afrofuturism, as discussed in Imaginary Worlds, it creates a kind of space for African futures, built from these perspectives that never were given the chance to evolve. Because these places are still affected and defined by colonial history. In What the Dead Man Said, this is reflected the way geography is reworked. The story acknowledges colonial history and says it did exist, but it creates things like Toronto, which is part of what used to be North America. And it kind of brings back that indigenous identity back, which isn't exactly Afrofuturism, but is still with that still fighting against colonial definition. Like North America is now not North America, New Biafra is this continuation and expansion of something that was essentially dissipated and was taken away. And now it kind of centralizes this community of people rather than the diaspora. The way that she uses Afrofuturism is in ways of reclamation, through language, its infrastructure, and social organizations. They're all reimagined through a lens in which African communities are able to thrive. Igbo people, or Igbo language, was incredibly suppressed, or Biafra was completely erased. But through this new world, Igbo is the main language of this place, and English is completely pushed out of the way. This continues the culture and self-definition of African culture. This imagined world, environmental collapse and the gendered expectations are still there, and the tensions do show that this future is still realistic and complex. Even though the existence of colonialism is lesser, they still have so many issues, which again goes back to the apocalypse is never singular. But Onwualu does give this Afrofuturist lens and a space in which African futures are shaping the world. They're carrying this history and creating new futures and possibilities. According to this podcast, the largest amount of speculative fiction in Africa comes from Nigeria and South Africa. And according to Chinelo, in a different interview actually, she says, I want to be that counterbalance to the white-dominated genre fiction that's happening in South Africa. I wanted to make sure that we have that space. If we are providing that space like no one else is doing right now, that gives me a joy. She says, in the Imaginary Worlds podcast, if we can't do it now, why not put it in what's to come? By this mutation of geography, she is mentioning that colonialism occurred, but reiterates that it has been rightfully reclaimed and redeveloped by the tribes that were native to the land. She's giving a space for people that have been robbed of the future they could have had, and perhaps giving hope for a future they could have. Nigeria has a very specific expectation when it comes to birth. According to this West Africa blog, the birth of a girl was viewed as a liability rather than a blessing, unlike the birth of a boy. The birth of a girl was seen as an economic burden, leading to instances where newborn girls were killed to avoid this perceived burden. It also says, religious leaders frequently preach that a girl's worth is tied solely to her purity, and there are extreme practices like honor killings in which a woman is murdered by a family member for actions perceived to have brought shame, or violations to rigid moral standards. This also goes back to the story in which when she was growing up and they caught him for doing these bad things to her, they blamed it on the family. They thought that she should be ashamed for what happened to her, and that it's a tarnished family. Now, going to sexual assault, this is going to be kind of a shorter one because I don't want to expand on this a lot. It just is a very important theme in the story. But in Nigeria, rape is incredibly counterproductive for women. They become re-victimized by the extremely patriarchal Nigerian criminal justice system. Laws of rape in Nigeria are tied to the norms and practices that are incredibly biased against women. It's also said in this article, there's a gendered obligation to bear children in Nigeria. When rape survivors give birth, it is very clearly a very triggering thing. A lot of the times, birth can result from an assault. A lot of the times, the procedures in which they're performing on you during childbirth can be invasive. Extreme trauma that Azuka endured and all of the cultural pressures and her whole family pressures really make you feel for her. It's very bad. What the Dead Man Said uses this birth concept as a political and emotional symbol. It has a vast history and cultural expectation. Azuka's expectations for giving birth is her burden, and it's tied to the catastrophe, the societal pressure, and the legacy of violence against women. Onwualu imagines this futuristic world in which parts of Nigeria have reclaimed and redefined themselves, yet still they are enduring the same types of inequalities, just in gender and reproductive expectations. Azuka is, rightfully so, very reluctant to give birth, and this is a reflection of the lasting impact of her sexual violence and the just general social stigma. Her father's ghost is an embodiment of unresolved guilt and generational weight placed on her and just women in general to continue the family legacy or line, even at the cost of their own comfortability and autonomy. Azuka's life is shaped by these overlapping apocalypses and catastrophes, environmental collapse, cultural pressure, personal trauma, and these all redefine what birth means to her. The story is one that the story does not give any kind of neat, tight ending or closure. It reveals that this is just the beginning, a slow, grueling process to acceptance. Azuka doesn't conform to any kind of societal pressures like having kids. Azuka does not forgive her father for what he neglected to do. She does not fully reconcile with the idea or memory of her past, but she does begin to learn to adapt and move forward from this event and events. The theme basically suggests that progress is learning to live and adapt with what remains afterward.